In this video, we're going to take a look at Monteverde Emotions Motivation. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. Here is an orange with tons of tone variation depending on what pen you put it in, and it can really bring the shading. Something that doesn't happen a whole lot with orange inks, and this even does it on some cheaper made papers. It's rare for an orange to do that, and I'm enjoying it a whole lot. In its darkest form, it's like an orange that's leaning, or it's like an orange leaning red. And that's just not my favorite though. So, that's something to consider when you're looking at this. We have a big time winner when it comes to this ink though. In the amount that it tends to shade, it just really, I don't see it a lot with orange. I'm happy to have this ink as a bottle as a result of that. I normally don't buy bottles, and this one I did. I can see using this ink up very quickly. And because of that, I am probably going to feel a loss when this bottle's empty, meaning I may need to search out a second bottle of it just to have one on standby. I do have a couple of orange inks that are my go-tos, and I think I'm going to put this in as a part of that go-to orange category. Really very nice. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Jinhao 159 with a 1.1 stub. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The fine nib has a very nice tone that it's giving. It's definitely orange. It's got a bit of red in the shading spot. There's no feather, there's no spread. I already mentioned it. There is shading, and it's doing it really well. Very impressive in what's happening here. The medium nib is a little bit darker than the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread. It still offers some of that shading. Now this medium is a little bit wetter writing, so we're seeing much more of the red there, but it's keeping enough of the orange that I can live with it, although it is quite a bit more red than is my preference. The double broad nib is much darker than everything on the page. It's showing much more red than orange. You do see some of the orange coming through though. Now there's no feather, there is no spread, there is shading. You see it in the word mercury, in the word in the word mercury. This is where we get mostly red, but just little bits of orange coming through. And again, it's just that it's not my preference, though what I think I'm seeing here looks really nice, very pleasing to the eye. And if I was someone that went for orange leaning reds, this would be it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pelikan M120 Idyllic Blue with a fine nib, a Pelikan P200 with a medium nib, a Pelikan M205 the Duo Highlighter with a double broad nib, The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we get a very nice orange here where it's shading to a red. So again, while the reds don't tend to be my thing, I think this is looking really good. The fine has no feather, it has no spread. Yes, it is shading. Yes, it looks really good. It's shading on a paper that is more absorbent, so not really prone to giving out that shading. The medium nib is just a tad bit darker than what we get with the fine. There's no feather, there is no spread, there is still some shading without a doubt, especially when we get to the third line. You're going to see the last word, unproved, and a lot of shading really comes through, especially there. For some reason, some of the first words I was writing were a bit darker. That top line shows a lot more of the red than the orange, not as much shading. The double broad nib has a tiny bit of feathering. It's putting down a ton of ink. It's not really spreading, so it's doing very good when it comes to that. We are getting some shading. You see on the second line where the experiments ends, and then you see the word with, you see the word tubes. You see shading throughout all of it, where it goes from a red to an orange to a red. Really very nice, kind of like the flames of a fire. That just makes me sound weird. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get little bits of shading that are going on. It's an absorbent paper, not expected to shade, and we are still getting it with the fine nib. We're getting a lot of the orange here with the red at the shading spots, at its darkest spots. So I think it's doing very well on this paper. I think this paper is doing very well with fountain pen ink. The medium nib is just a tad bit darker than the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. It's really a right at the orange leaning red end of the tone here. It's not fully red, but it's definitely not orange. Looking at the double broad, very wet. We are getting feathering, tiny featherings. I think it's manageable, especially since who would use a double broad nib on a reporter pad other than an idiot with a camera? Nobody. No spread, so it's doing great when it comes to that. We get no shading. Not really something I was expecting, so anytime it does show up, I'm pleasantly surprised. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we do get ghosting when it comes to the medium and the broad, not for the fine, but we got no bleed through touching the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we definitely have that orange tone here that goes into red. So let's start from the top. It has no feathering. Shocker. But these are reporter pads that I really have found performing quite well. There's no spread. There is shading going on. That's right. There's shading on cheap paper, or cheaply manufactured, or maybe even just what we would think of as cheap paper. We would be wrong. The medium nib is just a little bit darker than the fine. It has no feather, has no spread, has a couple of moments of shading. You can see the capital N on the top line does get a little lighter at the top. You do see in Adores some lighter tones, so it does show some of the lighter tones, though mostly it's more red leaning than you see on the orange. The double broad is by far the darkest tone on the page. It does feather, it's very wet. It doesn't spread though. It actually does shade. When you look at the top of the T in 2, you see on the top and the left, you see orange. On the second line in the, you see it goes from red to orange to red. So we are getting shading here, which is indeed surprising. Now, we had no bleed through that came through and touched the page underneath, but we cannot use the back of the page because you can see how deep the ink is getting, and there's a lot of ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Blaze Orange. Here is Elixir Tangerine. Here is Mont Blanc Lucky Orange. Here is Thornton's Orange. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we're still holding on to that orange tone on this paper, though we are getting a bunch of tiny feathers. These are tiny feathers, so they fall into that category for me on inexpensively produced paper that this is manageable. This isn't the end of the world. It wouldn't stop me from using this notebook. We're getting a little bit of spread. That's definitely not a fine anymore. It's maybe closer to a medium, but not quite a medium. We don't get any shading going on, which is unfortunate because we got to see it a bunch of times before. Looking at the medium nib, we get feathering, tiny feathering all over it. We do get some spread, almost to about a broad. We don't get any shading, none whatsoever. It is right about the same tone that we had with the fine. I don't like how this looks, but I do think this would work for just having to take some notes. I'd use the fine nib on this paper. Looking at a double broad, because why not be foolish? It is super dark. It is absolutely a red with no hint of orange. Does it feather? Of course it does. Does it spread? I'd say yes, it doesn't shade. Don't use a double broad in a reporter notebook. Looking at the page underneath, I circled tons. There was a lot of bleeding through and touching the page underneath. This really did horrific with this ink, but these are wetter pens. And you can see from the back, you could practically read the back of the page. All of it is completely coming through. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is Kaweco Paradise Blue. Here is KWZ Green Gold 2. Here is Noodler's Periwinkle. Here is Private Reserve Velvet Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we still hold on to a little bit of that orange. It's a red-leaning orange, so not for me, but not horrible. Yes, it feathers. We would expect that. Yes, it has some spread. We would expect that. It is manageable considering what this paper is. It gives no shading, which we don't expect on this paper. The medium nib is right about the same tone as the fine. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. It is manageable considering what the paper is. Looking at the double broad, it feathers, it spreads, it is the darkest tone on the page, it is absolutely red with no hint of orange. Orange, by the way, is supposed to be a motivational color. It's supposed to make you feel energetic. This one's not doing that. Looking at the page underneath, surprisingly, I only had the 2 dots that touch the next page, so it did bleed through with the medium and with the broad. Now, there's a lot of ghosting that's going on, as we expect with this paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? In a wet pen, it gets to be an orange-leaning red or full-on red, which is not my cup of tea, really not my preference. So I will definitely avoid using this in very wet pens or even wetter pens. Now, for me, I want that medium to dry flow, fine or medium, or even a dry stub. I really want to take advantage of the shading that this ink has to offer, because orange inks don't always give shading, and this one can. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.